1943, North Africa. Italian soldiers surrendered to American forces expecting torture and starvation. Instead, they were shipped to the United States, given work assignments on local farms, and told they could walk around unsupervised with no guards watching them. These men had been fed fascist propaganda about American brutality their entire lives, so when they arrived and saw what was really waiting for them, many broke down in disbelief. But what could possibly make hardened soldiers who'd been taught to see Americans as monsters completely abandon everything they believed in and never want to go home? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. In the scorching heat of North Africa in late 1943, the war was ending for thousands of Italian soldiers, but not in the way Mussolini had promised. For over 2 decades, Il Duce had filled their heads with dreams of a new Roman Empire, of Italian glory stretching across continents, of their rightful place as conquerors. Instead, these men found themselves retreating through the desert, their boots falling apart, their stomachs empty, their uniforms hanging loose on frames that had lost 30, sometimes 40 pounds. The Allied invasion had crushed them, and now they stumbled toward surrender with white flags made from torn undershirts. Giovanni Martinez was 28 years old, though he looked 50. Back home in Calabria, his family grew olives and vegetables on a small plot of land that had fed them for generations. The fascist officers had come to his village in 1941, rounded up every man between 18 and 40, and promised them they would return as heroes. Giovanni remembered his mother's face as they took him away. She knew better than to believe the promises. She had lived through the last war. 3 years later, Giovanni was surrendering to American soldiers near Tunis, his hands raised high, his heart pounding with a fear deeper than any he had felt in combat. The fascist propaganda officers had spent years telling him what Americans did to prisoners: torture, starvation, execution. He had seen the posters plastered in every barracks, showing Americans as demons with blood dripping from their teeth. Beside him stood Carlo Benedetti, a factory worker from Milan who was 35 but had stopped counting birthdays when the war began. Carlo had joined the fascist party because everyone joined, because you had to if you wanted to keep your job, to feed your children, to avoid the midnight knock on your door. But he had never believed, not really. He had seen through Mussolini's lies early, watching as the government built marble monuments while families went hungry, as they sent boys to die in Africa while party officials ate meat and drank wine. Now, as American soldiers approached their ragged group, Carlo wondered if this was how it would end, shot in the desert and left for the vultures. But the Americans did not shoot them. They separated the prisoners into groups, checked them for weapons, and then did something Giovanni couldn't understand. They handed out canteens of clean water. Real water, cool and clear, not the muddy stuff they had been drinking from shell craters. Giovanni drank so fast he choked. An American soldier, barely 20 years old with red hair and freckles, patted his back and smiled. It was a kind smile, not the smile of a man about to commit atrocity. Giovanni looked at Carlo, and Carlo looked back with the same confused expression. This was wrong. This was not what they had been told. The temporary prison camp was nothing like the torture chambers they expected. Yes, there was barbed wire, but the guards seemed almost bored, leaning on their rifles and smoking cigarettes. The Italians were processed one by one, fingerprinted like criminals, but then led to mess tents where the impossible happened. They were fed, not scraps, not moldy bread, real food. Soup with actual chunks of meat floating in it, white bread so soft Giovanni thought he might be hallucinating, and coffee, real coffee with sugar. He had not tasted sugar in 2 years. Some men wept as they ate. Others ate in silence, waiting for the trick, for the moment when the Americans would snatch it away and laugh. Giovanni had weighed 160 pounds when the war started. He now weighed 115. His ribs showed through his shirt like the bars of a cage. But as he sat in that tent, eating his second bowl of soup because the Americans kept refilling bowls, he felt something shift inside him. This was not what he had been told. These were not monsters. These were men, just men, and they were feeding their enemies while their own people had been starving them. Lieutenant Harris arrived at the camp 3 days later. He was 42 years old, a corn farmer from Iowa who spoke with a slow, gentle drawl that reminded Giovanni of his own father. Harris called an assembly, and through interpreters he made an announcement that rippled through the crowd like an electric shock. The prisoners were being transported to the United States. They would work on American farms. They would be paid a small wage, and here was the part that made no sense at all. They would work without guards watching their every move. If they ran, they would be caught eventually, but Harris said most men never ran because most men didn't want to. Giovanni turned to Carlo, searching his face for understanding. Freedom? Trust? These words had no place in their world. Under Mussolini, you were watched constantly. Your neighbors reported on you. Your children were taught to spy on their parents. The idea that an enemy would simply trust you, would let you walk around without chains or guns pointed at your back, was more shocking than any battle they had survived. Carlo whispered, his voice shaking, "This is a trick. It must be. They will shoot us when we try to leave." But even as he said it, he did not believe it. The evidence was piling up too high. The food, the medical care for the wounded, the way the American soldiers treated them not as animals, but as human beings who had simply been on the wrong side. That night, Giovanni lay on his cot in the prison tent, staring at the canvas ceiling. Around him, hundreds of men whispered in the darkness, trying to make sense of what was happening. They had been told their entire lives that America was weak, that Americans were soft and stupid, that Italian strength and discipline would crush them. But these Americans had crushed Italy without even trying, and now they were offering kindness where cruelty was expected. Giovanni touched his stomach, still full from dinner, and wondered what kind of country could afford to feed its enemies better than Italy fed its own soldiers. He wondered what else they had been lied to about. And as sleep finally came, one thought kept circling in his mind like a vulture. If America was this strong, this rich, this confident, how had they ever thought they could win? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The troop ship that carried Giovanni and Carlo across the Atlantic Ocean in late 1943 was nothing like the cattle cars that had transported them to the African front. They expected to be shoved into dark holds below deck, crammed together like animals, breathing stale air, thick with the smell of unwashed bodies. Instead, they were assigned actual bunks with thin mattresses and wool blankets. The holds had electric lights that stayed on during the day. Ventilation fans pushed fresh air through the spaces. Giovanni lay on his bunk the first night, unable to sleep, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Surely this comfort was temporary. Surely the real punishment would come. But it never came. 3 times a day, bells rang for meals, and the prisoners lined up in the mess hall where American sailors served them food from industrial kitchens that gleamed with stainless steel. Giovanni had never seen kitchens so clean, so organized, so efficient. Mountains of canned goods lined the walls, stacked floor to ceiling. Spam, something the Americans called it, came in tins and tasted salty and rich. White bread appeared at every meal. Canned peaches in sweet syrup made Giovanni's teeth hurt from the sugar. And there was always coffee, endless coffee, hot and strong and available for anyone who wanted it. Carlo stood beside Giovanni in the chow line one morning, watching as a cook casually opened a number 10 can of fruit cocktail, the kind of can that could feed 20 men. The cook dumped half of it onto serving trays and set the rest aside as if it were nothing. Carlo leaned close to Giovanni and whispered, his voice tight with confusion and something like anger. "This is a trick. They fatten us before the slaughter. My grandfather told me stories about the Romans. They fed prisoners well before the games." But even as he said it, Carlo knew it made no sense. Why waste this much food on men you planned to kill? Why give them medicine when they got seasick? Why let them walk on deck in the sunshine, breathing ocean air, watching dolphins race alongside the ship? On the fifth day at sea, something happened that Giovanni would remember for the rest of his life. A group of American sailors were celebrating someone's birthday on deck, and they had a real cake with white frosting and candles. After they finished eating, one sailor walked over to where the Italian prisoners sat and offered them the leftovers. Chocolate cake. Giovanni took a piece with trembling hands. He had not tasted chocolate in 4 years. His daughter had been 3 years old the last time he saw her, and she had cried for sweets that did not exist anymore in Italy. Now here he was, a prisoner on an enemy ship, eating chocolate cake while his child went hungry. The wrongness of it made his chest ache. The ship docked in New York Harbor on a gray morning in early spring of 1944. Giovanni stood at the rail with hundreds of other prisoners, staring at the Statue of Liberty rising from the water like something from a dream. The statue was bigger than any monument Mussolini had built, but there was something different about it. It was not built to scare people or show power. It was welcomed. The statue held up a torch like it was lighting the way home for lost travelers. An American guard standing nearby saw Giovanni staring and said through an interpreter, "She's beautiful, isn't she? My grandfather came here from Ireland, cried like a baby when he saw her." The guard said it with pride, but also with something softer, something Giovanni recognized from his own memories of home. Trains carried them inland, through cities that seemed to go on forever, past factories with smokestacks that never stopped working, through farmland so vast and green that Giovanni pressed his face to the window and wept. In Italy, every scrap of land was precious, fought over, divided among too many families. Here, fields stretched to the horizon with corn growing in perfect rows, wheat waving in the wind like an ocean of gold. Carlo sat across from him, silent, watching the same landscape roll past. Finally, Carlo said, "No wonder they won. Look at this. Just look at it. We were fighting a country that has everything, and we have nothing." Giovanni was assigned to Sarah Henderson's apple orchard in upstate New York, along with 5 other Italian prisoners. When the truck dropped them off, Giovanni expected to see barbed wire, guard towers, and armed soldiers. Instead, he saw a white farmhouse with blue shutters, a red barn that needed paint, and rows of apple trees heavy with spring blossoms. Mrs. Henderson came out to meet them, a woman in her late 30s with work-worn hands and tired eyes. She looked at the 6 Italian men standing in her driveway and said through an interpreter, "My 2 sons are in Europe right now, fighting. Maybe fighting your friends, maybe fighting your brothers, I don't know. But I need help to save this harvest or I lose everything. So we're going to work together and we're going to be civil about it." She handed each man a pair of work gloves, thick leather gloves that were better than any Giovanni had owned even before the war. Then she pointed to a small bunkhouse behind the barn and said, "That's where you sleep. Meals are at 6, noon, and 6. You work dawn to dusk, and if you're thinking about running, the nearest town is 8 miles that way. But I'll tell you the same thing the army probably told you. Most men don't run because most men figure out pretty quickly they got it better here than wherever they'd run to." Giovanni walked to the bunkhouse in a daze. No locks, no chains, no guards watching them. He could walk away right now. He could head into those woods and keep walking. But where would he go? Back to Italy where his family was starving? Into an America where he did not speak the language and had no papers? And stranger still, why would he want to leave? He had a bed, food, and work to do. He had more here as a prisoner than he ever had as a free man in fascist Italy. That night, Mrs. Henderson's 16-year-old daughter brought a pitcher of lemonade to the bunkhouse. Real lemonade with ice cubes floating in it, condensation dripping down the glass pitcher. She smiled at them without fear, this young girl alone with 6 enemy soldiers, and said, "Mama thought you might be thirsty." Giovanni took a glass and drank, the cold sweetness shocking his tongue, and he understood that everything he had been taught was a lie. America was not weak. America was not cruel. America was so strong, so rich, so confident that it could afford to treat its enemies with kindness. And that kindness was more devastating than any weapon Giovanni had ever faced. The weeks passed like water flowing downstream, steady and unstoppable. And with each day, Giovanni felt something inside him crack a little more. He woke before dawn with the other prisoners and worked in the apple orchard until the sun set, his hands learning again the rhythm of farm work he had known as a boy. Mrs. Henderson paid them 80 cents a day in special camp money that they could spend at the canteen in town. 80 cents could buy cigarettes, candy bars, soap that smelled like flowers, magazines with pictures of places Giovanni would never see. It was more money than many Italians back home earned in a week of factory work. On Sundays, Mrs. Henderson closed the farm work and invited the prisoners to attend church with the family if they wished. Giovanni went once, sitting in the back pew of a small white church with a steeple that pointed at heaven. He watched American families pray together, their children fidgeting in starched clothes, their voices rising in hymns he did not understand but felt in his bones. There were no fascist posters on the walls, no pictures of leaders demanding worship, no fear in anyone's eyes. After the service, families gathered outside and talked about normal things, about weather and crops and whose cow had given birth to twins. Nobody talked about war. Nobody looked at the Italian prisoners like they were monsters. An old woman even offered Giovanni a hard candy from her purse, pressing it into his palm with a wrinkled smile. Carlo worked in the fields beside Giovanni, and sometimes they talked about what was happening to them, what it meant, how they would ever explain this to anyone back home. Carlo said one afternoon while they were pruning branches, "I believed in it, you know. Not at first, but after a while. I thought Mussolini was building something great. I thought we were creating an empire that would last 1,000 years. I let myself believe because the alternative was too frightening." He cut a dead branch and watched it fall. But we were not building anything. We were destroyed. We were starving our own people while we dreamed of conquering others. And here, these Americans whom we called weak, who we said would collapse under Italian strength, they are so strong they can afford to be kind. That is real power. That is what we never understood. The turning point came on Thanksgiving Day in November 1944. Mrs. Henderson insisted that the 6 Italian prisoners join the family for dinner. Giovanni tried to refuse, saying it was not proper, that they were prisoners and should eat in the bunkhouse. But Mrs. Henderson would hear none of it. "My boys are eating in some mess tent in France right now," she said, her voice catching. "The least I can do is make sure someone's sons eat a decent meal at a proper table. Now, wash your hands and come inside." The dining room table was covered with a white cloth that had been washed and ironed until it shined. On top of it sat more food than Giovanni had seen in one place since before the war. A turkey so big it must have weighed 20 pounds, its skin golden and crispy. Mashed potatoes in a bowl the size of a wash basin, swimming in butter. Cranberry sauce that wobbled like jelly. Green beans with slivers of almonds. The rolls were so soft they seemed to melt when you bit them. And pies, 3 different pies, apple and pumpkin, and something called pecan that was so sweet it made Giovanni's eyes water. Giovanni sat at that table, surrounded by his fellow prisoners and this American family, and something broke inside him. Not broken like a bone breaks, but broke like a dam breaks, releasing everything he had been holding back. He thought of his mother in Calabria, rationing bread crusts to make them last the week. He thought of his sister who had written to him before his capture, telling her about eating grass soup because there was nothing else. He thought of his daughter who had never tasted chocolate, who had never seen an orange, who went to bed hungry more nights than not. And here he sat, a prisoner of war, eating food that would feed his entire village for a week. Tears ran down his face, and he could not stop them. Mrs. Henderson saw and said nothing, just patted his hand once and passed him the potatoes. Across the table, Carlo was crying too, silent tears that dripped onto his plate. The other prisoners sat frozen, forks halfway to their mouths, their faces showing the same realization that was crashing over them like a wave. They had been lied to about everything. Everything. That night, Giovanni sat in the bunkhouse with a pencil and paper he had bought at the canteen. He had been keeping a diary, hiding it under his mattress, writing down everything he saw and felt because he knew nobody would believe him otherwise. Now he wrote by lamplight while the others slept. "Mussolini told us we were building an empire," he wrote in Italian, his hand shaken. "He told us we were superior, that we deserved to rule, that others were weak and we were strong. But we were starving while he built monuments to himself. Our children went hungry while he posed for photographs. And we believed him because we wanted to believe, because the truth was too terrible to face." Giovanni paused, listening to the sound of Carlo snoring in the next bunk, to the wind moving through the apple trees outside. He continued writing. "Here in America, even the prisoners eat like kings. We have warm beds and clean water and work that pays us money. We are treated with more respect than our own government ever gave us. The guards trust us to work without watching. The families feed us at their tables. And I realize now that this is what real strength looks like. Not armies marching in perfect lines, not leaders shouting from balconies. Real strength is having so much that you can afford to share it with your enemies. Real strength is being so secure that you can show kindness without fear." He thought about Lieutenant Harris, who had visited the farm the week before and told Giovanni he was a good worker, that he was honest and reliable, and that these qualities mattered more than which uniform a man had worn. Giovanni had felt pride at those words, real pride, the kind he had never felt when fascist officers screamed at him about duty and honor. This quiet American farmer had given him something the fascists never could: simple human dignity. Giovanni finished his diary entry as the lamp burned low. "How do I go home and explain this?" he wrote. "How do I tell my family that I was treated better by my enemies than by my own leaders? How do I make them understand that everything we suffered was for nothing, for lies, for the ego of men who never missed a meal while we starved? I came to America as a prisoner expecting death. Instead, I found the truth, and the truth is this. We were not defeated by American weapons. We were defeated by American abundance, by their confidence, by their ability to show mercy when they could have shown cruelty. That is the power we could never match. That's why we lost." The war in Europe ended in May 1945, and by summer, the Italian prisoners began their journey home. Giovanni stood on the deck of another troop ship, this time heading east instead of west, watching the New York skyline shrink behind him. In his duffel bag, he carried things that seemed impossible: 6 cans of peaches that Mrs. Henderson had insisted he take, a baseball that her daughter had given him with signatures scribbled across the white leather, photographs of the orchard in full bloom, and his diary wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture. These objects felt heavier than their actual weight, as if they carried the burden of everything he had learned, everything he now knew that he wished he did not. Carlo stood beside him at the rail, clutching a book about American agricultural methods that he had bought with his saved wages. He planned to use it to modernize his family's small farm outside Milan, to bring American efficiency to Italian soil. They did not talk much on the voyage home. What was there to say? They were returning to a country that had been destroyed, to families who had suffered while they had eaten 3 meals a day, to a world that would not understand what they had experienced. How do you explain to people who have been bombed and starved that their enemies had treated you with kindness? How do you tell them that everything they had believed was a lie, without destroying what little hope they had left? The ship docked in Naples on a scorching July morning. The harbor was crowded with broken vessels, half-sunk ships that nobody had the money or energy to salvage. The city beyond looked like something from a nightmare. Buildings stood with their walls blown away, showing the insides of apartments like dollhouses, furniture still visible in rooms open to the sky. Rubble filled the streets in mountains of broken brick and twisted metal. Children with stick-thin arms and distended bellies ran alongside the prisoners begging for food, their eyes huge in their skeletal faces. Giovanni reached into his duffel and pulled out a can of peaches, handing it to a boy who could not have been more than 7. The boy ran away clutching it like treasure, And Giovanni felt sick knowing that one can of peaches, something Americans threw away half-eaten, was wealth beyond measure here. The train ride from Naples to Calabria took 2 days because the tracks were damaged and had to be repaired in sections. Giovanni sat by a window watching the Italian countryside roll past, and every mile made his heart heavier. Fields lay fallow and overgrown because there were no men to work them and no equipment that still functioned. Villages appeared empty, their populations scattered or dead. In one town, he saw women and old men pulling a plow themselves because all the horses had been eaten during the winter of 1944. This was the empire Mussolini had promised, this wasteland of suffering and destruction. Giovanni's village appeared unchanged at first glance. The same stone houses clustered on the hillside, the same olive groves marching up the slopes. But as he walked the familiar streets with his duffel over his shoulder, he saw the changes. Every house had black mourning cloths hanging in the windows. Every family had lost someone. The village square where children used to play was silent and empty. The church bells that used to ring the hours had been melted down for metal to make weapons that had not saved anyone. His mother was sitting outside their house peeling potatoes when Giovanni came around the corner. She looked up and for a moment did not recognize him, because he was healthy, because he had gained back weight, because his uniform was clean and his face was not hollow with hunger. Then she screamed and dropped the knife and ran to him, and Giovanni caught her in his arms and felt how light she was, how fragile, like holding a bird made of paper. She weighed perhaps 90 pounds. His mother, who had been stout and strong, now felt like she might break if he squeezed too hard. His sister appeared in the doorway, and Giovanni almost wept at the sight of her. Her dress hung on a frame that was nothing but bones covered in skin. Her hair had gone thin and brittle. She was 26 years old and looked 50. She smiled at him with teeth that were loosed in her gums from lack of proper food and said, "You're alive. We prayed every day you were alive." Giovanni wanted to tell her where he had been, what he had seen, how he had lived while she had suffered, but the words stuck in his throat because they felt like a betrayal. That evening, the family gathered for dinner, and Giovanni unpacked his duffel. His mother and sister stared at the cans of peaches like they were looking at gold bars. His niece, his sister's daughter, who was 5 years old and had never known anything but war, picked up the baseball and turned it over in her hands, confused by this strange white sphere covered in red stitching. Giovanni opened one can of peaches and divided the contents among the family. They ate slowly, making each slice last, savoring the sweetness like it was a religious experience. His mother cried while she ate. His sister held each piece of peach in her mouth until it dissolved. The child licked the syrup from her fingers and asked if there was more in heaven. After dinner, Giovanni walked through the village and saw the same scene repeated in every house. Families gathered around meager meals, old people who had survived by eating things that should not be eaten, children who had never known abundance. He thought about Mrs. Henderson's Thanksgiving table, about the turkey that could have fed 30 people, about the pies that had been so plentiful they gave slices to prisoners. He thought about the camp canteen where you could buy candy anytime you wanted, about the Coca-Cola truck that delivered soda like it was water, about the casual waste of food that would have saved lives here. Giovanni could not sleep that night. He lay on his childhood bed, too soft after months of the firm mattress in the bunkhouse, and listened to his mother coughing in the next room. She had tuberculosis, he was certain of it, but there was no medicine, no doctors who could help, no hospitals that still functioned. In America, even prisoners got medical care when they were sick. Here, Italian citizens died of diseases that could be cured with pills that cost pennies. Over the following weeks and months, Giovanni became known in the village as someone who had seen America, who had worked there, who understood how things could be different. Men came to him asking questions about farming methods, about democracy, about how a country could be so rich while Italy was so poor. Giovanni told them the truth as he understood it. He explained that America's strength came not from conquest, but from production, not from taking from others, but from making things, growing things, building things. He talked about the respect American workers had, the wages they earned, the voice they had in their own government. Carlo, up in Milan, was doing the same thing. He had returned to find his factory destroyed and his union leaders dead or scattered. But he began organizing again, this time with a different vision. He had seen how American workers lived, the dignity they possessed, the safety standards in their factories, the fair wages they fought for and won. He became a voice for labor reform, arguing that Italian workers deserved the same respect, the same voice, the same share of what they produced. When factory owners called him a communist, he laughed and said, "I learned this in America, the most capitalist country on earth. This is not about communism, this is about human dignity." Giovanni and Carlo wrote letters to each other, sharing their experiences of trying to bring change to a broken country. They also wrote letters to America. Giovanni sent a letter to Mrs. Henderson, thanking her for her kindness, for treating him like a human being when she could have treated him like an enemy. She wrote back and included a care package with canned goods, powdered milk, and chocolate for his niece. These packages continued until 1947, small lifelines from a country that had been generous even in victory. In 1950, Giovanni sat with his grandchildren, his sister's children, who were growing up in a new Italy, one that was slowly rebuilding, slowly finding its way toward democracy. They asked him about the war, about what it was like to be a prisoner. Giovanni pulled out his old duffel bag, which he had kept all these years. He showed them the baseball, faded now, but still holding the signatures. He showed them photographs of the orchard, and he read to them from his diary the words he had written by lamplight in a bunkhouse in upstate New York. "I want you to understand something," Giovanni told his grandchildren, his voice serious. "I was captured in Africa expecting to die. Instead, I was sent to America where I was trusted, fed, and treated like a human being. I worked without guards. I ate at my employer's table. I was paid for my labor, and I learned a lesson that I carried home and that I want to give to you." The children leaned forward, listening. Giovanni continued, "The war taught me that power is not about how many armies you have or how loud your leader shouts. Power is about how you treat the weakest among you. America was strong not because of its weapons, though its weapons were mighty. America was strong because even its prisoners ate better than our soldiers, because even its enemies were given dignity, because it could afford to show mercy without fear. That is real power. That is the kind of country we must build here." He looked at the children, their faces so much healthier than his sisters had been at their age, their eyes bright with the hope of a future that might actually come. A nation's true strength is measured by its humanity, not its conquest. Not by what it takes, but by what it gives. Not by who it destroys, but by who uplifts. I learned this as a prisoner of war, and it is the most valuable thing I brought home from America. More valuable than the food, more valuable than the money I saved. I brought home the truth that there is another way to live, another way to be strong, and that truth helped rebuild this country from the ashes. The duffel bag, with its faded contents, now sits in a small museum in Calabria, next to Giovanni's diary. School children visit and read his words, learning about the Italian prisoners who went to America expecting cruelty and found kindness, who returned home not as broken men but as ambassadors of a different way of thinking. The exhibit does not glorify war or celebrate defeat. Instead, it tells a simple truth, that America won more Italian hearts through compassion than it ever could have through force, and that those men came home and helped build a democracy because they had lived it, breathed it, and been transformed by it. The victory was not in the surrender, but in what came after, in the seeds of change planted by kindness and watered by human dignity. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.